I'm Polly Warren and welcome to the Positive Perimenopause podcast. This is the place for some positive inspiration to help you through the rollercoaster ride of perimenopause. I truly believe that with the right support, knowledge and wellness tools, you can feel your best yet, because I'm learning this life phase can be a truly exciting and often pivotal time of life. With every episode, my mission is to support and empower you to own your menopause, because it's time to start taking care of the most important person, and yes, that's you. So thank you for being here and sharing your time with me. Now let's dive in. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. I hope you are all doing really well. So just to recap from last week's episode, which was all about the power of the mind, particularly at this stage of life, and how helpful it can be to not only help us to integrate any lifestyle or diet modifications we're making at this stage into our lifestyle and make it easy, but also how powerful the mind can be in just our perception of midlife and getting older, and ultimately how it makes us feel going forward. And I've really truly discovered this stuff for myself, and I've never felt kind of more grounded and more happy to be myself than I do at the moment. So if you haven't already listened, go and have a listen. And as always, I'd love to hear any feedback or comments you have. So on to this week's episode. Now, I have a confession to make about this week's episode. At the beginning of most of my episodes, I love to ask my guests to share a little bit about their own story, their own perimenopause story, because that's how we learn about other people's experiences, about how this perimenopause experience can be so different for so many of us. And it's always just so fascinating to hear how people have got through it themselves and what methods they've used. Now, Dr. Jenn Salib, who I speak to on this episode, has a wonderful story. And just before I pressed record, when we were chatting, I asked her, I said, are you happy to share your story? I would love to share it and love to talk about it. And she was, yes, of course, Polly. I would love to talk about it. So I pressed record. And then what did I do? I completely forgot to ask her the question to tell me about her story. I went straight in to what she does and all that other good stuff. But the part where to give her the opportunity to share her story was completely and utterly missed. And I only realised when I ended the call and sort of sat back and thought about it and was like, oh my goodness, I forgot to ask her my first question and the really juicy part. And so, of course, I then was thinking, what a donut. Oh my goodness, what is Jen going to think of me? I asked her if it was going to be all right to ask that question. I never asked the question. And very easily, I could have gone into that downward negative spiral of beating myself up, which, if I'm totally honest, I did a little bit. But I want to share this with you because there was my perimenopause brain in full flourishing flow of being a perimenopausal brain. Sometimes we forget things. And do you know what? It's okay. I want to share this with you to show you and tell you that we all do it. And actually, we've got to stop beating ourselves up about it and just accept that this happens. And let's try and see the bright side. Let's laugh at it. It's not the end of the world. And I'm sure Jen probably wasn't thinking, oh my gosh, what was she doing? What an idiot. So that is why I share that with you. I still really think you're going to enjoy the conversation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Jen's story so that you have the backing. And I'm learning. I think this is my 13th episode in. I'm still learning. And we've got to be kind to ourselves and show ourselves some self-compassion, because otherwise we'd never do anything, would we? So there we go. So on to this week's episode. And it is, as I said, with the wonderful Dr. Jenn Salib. Now, Jen is a registered dietitian. She's a naturopathic doctor and an intuitive eating advocate. So what she does is she provides health and hormone education to women in midlife without a side of diet culture. So if you've been someone who has had different patterns of dieting throughout your life, this episode is for you. So Jenn really is on a mission to help women thrive in midlife. And whether you're looking to understand what's happening with your hormones or you want help finding food freedom, she helps women like you find the confidence you deserve in perimenopause and menopause. So Jenn was born and raised in the Atlantic provinces of Canada. She's a mum to 3 kids, including a set of twins, and she says she loves her cats almost as much as her kids. So Jenn's passion for women's health stems, like so many of us, from many of her own experiences. As a mother and as a woman in perimenopause, she fully understands what it's like to be in this stage of life. So she's experienced many of these symptoms firsthand, and that's really allowed Jenn to help others by using her own personal experience, alongside, of course, her training and her experience as a naturopathic doctor and as a registered dietitian. So Jenn herself, she began dieting at a very young age and went on, as she says, to become a professional dieter. She longed to see the ideal thin Jenn staring back at her in the mirror for most of her adult years. But despite doing all the so-called, in inverted comma, right things, like exercising, trying every new diet out there, and on top of that, getting 2 degrees related to nutrition, her body fought back and she discovered that it was not the answer. So thankfully, the seeds of intuitive eating were planted somewhere along this journey of hers, and she began making small shifts in how she responded to her body's needs. And this is what we talk about on the podcast and how she helps other women with this. So she no longer wanted to push her body to its limits through dieting and restriction, but instead she wanted to nurture it to its best. And now she helps others do the same. So I really loved chatting to Jenn, and I think you're going to really love it as well. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome you to Dr. Jenn Salib Huber. So hi, Jenn. It's lovely to have you here today. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much, Polly, for having me.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. So Jenn, one of the biggest challenges that many of us have when we hit perimenopause is that our body shape starts to change. Even when often we're eating exactly what we've always eaten and we're moving in the same way that we've always moved. Maybe we can start today by talking a bit about why is this? Why do our bodies start to change during the perimenopause?
Yeah, and I love this question because you're right. It is something that happens to, I'd say, most women. When you look at studies that are asking women about their experiences and about their symptoms and what they're going through, body changes, weight changes are right up there with hot flashes as some of the more common, but also some of the more bothersome, I think, experiences that we go through. And you're right. It's often because it feels like it's happening to us. Even for people who have maybe, had a lifelong relationship with healthy eating and movement, and maybe they're even doing more, and yet they still feel like something is changing. So I always start with the premise that we need to start from a place of trusting and believing that bodies change. And so often I think, I'm going to lump it and say that women in midlife, kind of my age, mid 40s, were really exposed more so than others through the media in the 80s and the 90s to this idea of the ideal weight, or this weight range, or this number that you should arrive at and stay at for the rest of your life. And we know that bodies change for all kinds of reasons. Some of them are within our control and some of them aren't. So, but one of the things that happens in perimenopause is that as our hormone levels start to change, especially the relationship between estrogen and progesterone, that changes where our body distributes our assets. as I like to say. And so if you are someone who has maybe always had the typical pear shape, you may find yourself looking a little more apple-like. And that's because of these changes that are pre-programmed into our DNA. So it wouldn't be, I think, a reasonable expectation for someone at 50 to still be wearing the clothes they wore at 30, even if the scale hasn't changed all that much, because our bodies change. And so one of the things that I like to try and I guess express and teach is this idea of having self-compassion for that. And so if we can have self-compassion for the ideas that bodies change, it's not our fault. It's nothing that we've done to cause it. And we don't have to make all our decisions around trying to correct it. We can start to have a relationship with food and movement that is built on working with our bodies instead of against it.
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? It is that self-compassion, which I think so many of us don't give ourselves. And I think maybe a lot of the problem is that when our bodies are changing and we're not fitting into the clothes that we used to be able to fit into, it makes us instantly feel a bit uncomfortable. And then we immediately feel like we've got to do something about it. What would be a simple kind of tool to give women in that self-compassion piece? Because it's a very real feeling, isn't it? It's a very real feeling that we go, oh God, I don't like the way my body looks. I never used to look like this. I've got a lot more of a belly around the middle. When I sit down, it kind of goes over my trousers. And how do we learn to love that? How do we learn to love that part of us and that change?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. And I'm going to come back to that. And so if I forget, bring me back to that.
Yeah.
But I just want to touch on something that you said earlier, that we often have that thought of, oh, I need to start controlling, restricting, planning. And that's the first step in the diet cycle. So for listeners who may not be familiar with the diet cycle, it is the predictable series of events that happens when we are prompted or triggered or cued to start a diet based on believing that we need to lose weight, someone telling us that we need to, but it's often that very relatable feeling of, I don't like how I look. I don't like how my clothes fit. I have to do something about it. And if the only thing that you know to do is to start trying to lose weight through restriction and exercise and counting calories, that's going to be, the only step that you make, even if you've done that 100 times and it has never resulted in, quote unquote, success or what you were hoping to achieve. And so the first step that I teach is getting people into the undieting cycle, which is being able to recognize that thought and to press pause. So being able to, sit with the discomfort, I guess, a little bit, but also just to kind of dig a little deeper into, why do I feel like I need to change my body to do whatever, whether it's feel good in my clothes, whether it's improve my health, whether it's, feel confident in my skin? What is the programming that is existing there on a loop, kind of on autoplay, telling me that the only way that I can do that is if I fit into this size of clothing or if I'm, at this number? And that's not an easy answer. For a lot of people, that's kind of where the big work is. But that's kind of the first step. But I think that the practical tool that I love introducing to people is the idea of body neutrality. And so believing that, if we let our body image drive our self-image bus, meaning that if all of our feelings about who we are, our worth and our value and what we can bring to the world and what people want from us in this world is based on how we look, there's very little flexibility there if your body changes for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. There are many reasons why our bodies change or what they look like on the outside. That might be losing hair. That can be, some kind of scar or something on our bodies, or it can be what clothing size we wear. But if all of our self-esteem and self-image is being driven by what we look like, it's a very, very shaky ground to exist on. So this idea of body neutrality is kind of giving yourself a little bit more breathing room and investing a little bit more time and energy into the things that aren't being influenced by what you look like. And so, those are the things I think that, are a little bit less tangible because they aren't a number, but they really help to expand our sense of worth. And so I always say that with body image, the best thing you can do is to take the focus off your body. Yeah. And that's really what body neutrality is.
Yeah, I love this because I'm all into building awareness. And once we can kind of build that awareness and then connect really within ourselves to who we really are, to our inner being as such, then and learn to love that part of us and recognize that part of us, then our external being actually, we've obviously got to get in sync with our body. But actually, we are far more likely to accept ourselves for who we are at this particular moment in time. So yes, I really, really totally agree with that. Let's go back to the diet cycle, which you talked about, because, I mean, as you said, most of us think, oh, well, the answer then is to restrict food if I want to get to the shape that I feel I ought to be, which we know, I think it was you who I heard say that 95% of diets fail, that they are not the answer. They are not
I mean, that number is a little bit contentious in that I don't think you can really ever point something down to that number, but I think it's very safe to say that if we're looking at long-term, quote unquote, success, and as little as 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, the very few studies that have gone on for 5 years, most of the time they don't work in the way that people want them to, and often result in more weight gain or a higher kind of, weight than when people started. And so in my book, that is not an evidence-based treatment strategy, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you maybe just explain to us about this diet cycle, why it doesn't work, why it's not the answer?
Yeah, and I'd love to. And so I often talk about the diet cycle as being a trap that we find ourselves in, or kind of like a Groundhog Day, right? So something prompts you, triggers you, makes you feel, believe, think that you have to lose weight. And because our brain likes to create shortcuts to save energy, it has created a shortcut that when you have that feeling, the only solution is to start a diet. And starting a diet for most people is controlling food or trying to control that calorie in, calorie out equation with food and exercise. And initially that response feels good because we've done something about that bad feeling. And so our brain says, yes, this is good. You've got a plan. Excellent. This time it's going to work. I promise it's going to be different. You just have to keep doing what, you feel like you need to do. And there is often like a honeymoon phase of, oh, I've got a plan. This is going to work. I'm excited. I can't wait to see what life is going to be like on the other side when I finally get to where I want to be. But that restriction creates deprivation. And deprivation is also an uncomfortable feeling that we don't like to be in. And so the longer that we deprive ourselves of food that we enjoy, or the longer that we're trying to control and restrict, the more we start to feel deprived. And eventually, for almost everyone, we, kind of quote, fall off the wagon with that deprivation. And often what we need to feel satisfied when we start saying yes and eating the foods that we've been restricting is often more than we would typically need to feel satisfied, which is why some people feel like when they kind of fall off the wagon, that they fall into a binge or a binge cycle. Even if it's not, binge eating in the clinical sense, it is often, a catching up of eating the things that you haven't been allowing yourself to have. And then that's what gets us back into the diet cycle, because eventually that feeling of, oh, I've got to do something. I don't feel good in my body. I don't feel good about my food choices. I have to start a diet, starts all over again. So that's kind of the diet cycle in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's that restriction, isn't it? When we know that we can't have something, it immediately and I know for myself, the moment I can't have something, I want it, whatever it might be, I want it. And so it's very much that sort of scarcity mindset versus that abundant mindset, isn't it? Yep. It's about kind of really focusing on what we can have and what we can't have. I think, however, lots of women listening to this, lots of people would say, so how then do I control myself? I don't trust myself to actually not eat the foods which I know are not good for me. a very quick break to ask you to hit the follow or subscribe button if you haven't already. And if you're enjoying this episode, I'd be super grateful if you could hit those stars and rate it too. Thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, that is also, I think, the root of why we start diets, right? Is that we believe that we should be able to control it and that controlling it is the only solution. So the way that we build that trust is by what I call the undieting process, and which is kind of unlearning why you have come to believe what you believe and being able to really question whether those beliefs are true for you. So I often say, are these beliefs true all the time? Are they sometimes true, or are they never true? And so, that I think gives us a little bit of permission to explore it. And then through that undieting process, we also introduce the principle of intuitive eating. We have these hunger and fullness cues and signals and feedback mechanisms in place. We have hungry. And if we can start to what I call lead with satisfaction, so that we're honoring taste preferences and even honoring cravings, because, that's a normal part of eating, is wanting something because it looks good or tastes good, or, it will be fun to eat. But then also building in some of those principles of gentle nutrition around building a balanced plate. So, if I want to have, a cookie at lunchtime, if I say, okay, what do I want? Oh, I want a cookie. Well, having 10 cookies might fill me up, but it's not going to be satisfying. And I'm probably not going to feel great after. But if I have a cookie and a sandwich and maybe some fruit salad, I have honored my taste hunger, I've honored my physical hunger, and I've had enough to feel full and satisfied in a way that will help me to feel good for the rest of the afternoon. And I think it's that permission piece of being able to say yes or no, but also, like you were saying, is leading with that abundance mindset that I can say yes to pretty much anything that I want, but it doesn't mean that I have to say yes to only that.
Okay, so for example, say I am desperately craving a donut, which is sitting in my kitchen, and I'm like, I've got it. There's a pack in my. I always talk about donuts because I have a real thing for donuts. What has happened before is there might be 5 donuts sitting in the bag, and I'll have one, and then I can't stop thinking about the others, and I'll go back and have another one. And I know though that really isn't that's not the best thing for me to be eating, because actually I probably should have a proper meal, but I'm going and snacking. How do I get out of that sort of cycle of like, I really want the donuts? So from what I'm hearing, it's like, oh, well, allow myself to have the donuts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing is that we sometimes create craving by restricting foods that we enjoy and by not having regular access to it. So in the example of donuts or chips or chocolate, it doesn't matter what it is. If you're only allowing yourself to have it under certain circumstances, you will always need more to feel full and satisfied than if you were able to respond to that craving or taste hunger, kind of in the moment situation. And so I talk about food neutrality along with body neutrality, and that we kind of want to get away from calling foods good or bad, because that again sets up that kind of dichotomy of I'm good if I'm being good by eating good food, or I'm bad by being bad when I'm having bad food. And those feelings don't actually help us to make good decisions. We know that shame is a terrible motivator and that it never actually works to accomplish what we want it to in the long term. So the first thing I would say is like just have access. If donuts are your favorite food, then you need them on a regular basis, meaning you need to have access to being able to say yes. It doesn't mean that you will always want them, but it means that you need to believe you have access to them when you want them, and that you have permission to say yes. And maybe it becomes part of a meal. So maybe you have a donut with your lunch, but you also have other things, so that you're not only honoring your taste hunger, but you're also thinking about, okay, building a balanced plate means that I want to have things from each of the groups. I want to have some protein, I want to have some fat, I want to have some carbohydrate. And I know that by building that balanced plate most of the time, doesn't have to be perfect, I will be fueling my body in a way that is honoring my health and my goals. but we don't take away from the quote unquote good foods that we're adding to our plate by having a donut, which is what I think the other thing is too, is that we kind of get into this mindset that if we're being bad, then we're just going to be all in. If I had the donut for lunch, well, then I might as well have the chips as a snack, and I might as well have this, and I might as well have that, because I've like undone all of my goodness by having that. But if we see it as part of the choices we can make, and we're not ranking it as better or worse, it's just one of the choices we can make if it's what we want, it becomes a lot easier to, I don't want to say moderate it, but it just, the interest in eating more than we need to feel satisfied really starts to diminish, because we know we can have it anytime.
Yeah, which totally makes sense. It does totally make sense.
It makes sense, but I'm not saying it's easy. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, when I work with people, this is, you know, often a 3 to 6 month process of kind of unlearning what we believe and then reprogramming, as I call it. So I'm a big fan of using, you know, kind of facts and evidence, but also experience to be able to reprogram our beliefs, because it has to be true for us. We have to experience it as true for our own relationship with food, and not just something that I'm saying or something that you read. And, you know, one of the things that I often encourage people to do is to put out their favorite food. So chips are an example. People often say, well, I can't buy chips because I can't have them in the house, because as soon as I open the bag, I have to have the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Even if I put them in a bowl and I go to the couch, I'm going to be right back at the cupboard. But if I say, put them on your plate at every meal, make it a choice that you can make at every meal, it's often a matter of days at most before they realize that I actually don't want it at every meal. It's not satisfying to have it all the time. And they're able to, but they know that they can say yes. And so maybe they do have it at some meals, but the need and the desire to have all of it at once to feel satisfied just kind of vaporizes. And so it's a process, but it definitely takes trust and it takes practice.
I kind of like this approach because actually it's not cutting anything out, because I have myself always been, the sugar has always been something which I feel like I have been in battle with forever, because I would always describe myself as I've got a real sweet tooth. And so I do binge on it. So for me, when I restrict it and I cut it out, which I can do for quite some length of time, and I feel good about myself, I feel better, I don't need it. However, when something triggers me to have the sugar again, for some reason, I do tend to then go, oh, right, well, I'm in now, and I'll binge. So what you're saying really does make sense, because even though I can restrict sugar for a month or 2 months, I'll always go back to it. So it is a completely different way of thinking. And it will make me really think about how I work with my clients, because I would never tell them not to have sugar anyway. Yeah. But I know personally for me, it does make me feel better when I don't have it.
And you're absolutely right that most people actually who feel like they have, you know, I don't want to say a bad relationship with sugar, but just feel like it is something that they have, you know, worked at changing, one, are often trying to do it in an all or nothing way. And so believing that sugar is the problem, that leads them to the belief that if they cut it out entirely, that's the solution. And, you know, there's a lot of parallels that are drawn between sugar and drugs and alcohol that actually there isn't enough evidence to say that we should be drawing those parallels, right? So there's quite a bit of evidence against the idea that food can be addictive in the physical way that drugs and alcohol can. Absolutely, there can be a psychological dependence on the behaviors, but on the foods themselves, there's not a ton of evidence for that. And so the idea that we need to cut it out completely, I don't think is an evidence-based kind of recommendation at this point. But I think what the thing that I always tell people is that I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit for why you're feeling better. And I'm not saying this is true for you, but oftentimes when people are cutting out sugar, they're also adding in other things. They're adding in maybe some meal planning. They're adding in more variety. They're maybe adding in more balanced meals. They're maybe adding in meditation, better sleep, more movement. But they're not giving themselves the credit for why they're feeling better. they're saying, oh, look, I cut out sugar and look at all of these other things that happened. And when in fact, it's the things that you added in that are helping you to feel better and not the thing that you cut out in most cases. So it's just another way of looking at it.
Yeah. So it's about adding in. So what things would you recommend to add in to a perimenopausal woman?
Yeah. And so I definitely love the add-in approach. And that's one of the kind of foundations of intuitive eating, is that we're adding in. And even just that little bit of a mindset shift is much more about permission and abundance than it is restriction or scarcity. So I often encourage women to try on or add in plant-based protein, especially soy. So soy is a legume, but it contains a lot of phytoestrogens in the form of isoflavones. And these isoflavones, for some women, and I'm one of them, can really help to control symptoms like hot flashes and night sweats. I'm not saying that it is equivalent to HRT, but for many people who, didn't tolerate HRT or can't take it, and I'm one of them, including these phytoestrogens on a regular basis can be a game changer. But there are also great sources of protein, which is one of the gentle nutrition kind of priorities for women in midlife. We know that protein helps us to build and maintain muscle, and it is, contributes to satisfaction at a meal. And in general is something that I think people can really kind of relate to. Oh, when I have protein at a meal, I feel more satisfied. I feel more full. I feel like my energy is more stable. So I really like this, adding in something that has kind of that double benefit. And of course, those plant-based proteins in the form of legumes and beans and lentils are also great sources of fiber. They have iron, they often have magnesium. So from a midlife perspective, you get a lot of bang for your buck by adding in plant-based protein, and specifically trying to add in soy and flax on a regular basis. So that's kind of one of my favorite suggestions for people to try on.
When you talk about intuitive eating, so maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about what exactly what you mean by that.
Yeah, so intuitive eating is a framework, as I call it, for developing a relationship with food that is based on attunement or learning to listen to your body's kind of wants and needs. So the framework was developed by two dietitians, Elise Reich and Evelyn Tribole, and they've written a book that I think is in its 4th edition now, but there's hundreds of studies supporting intuitive eating. But it's really based on the foundation is rejecting the diet mentality. So rejecting the idea that we have to carefully count, control, measure, plan every meal, because that's probably not consistent with what we actually need. I mean, our species has survived up until this point, for 98% of our existence without knowing how many calories we were eating or without having access to that kind of information. So we can probably assume that we don't need to control everything in order to thrive and survive. And then from that, which is where a lot of the undieting work comes in, is kind of, deprogramming those beliefs, but learning to listen to hunger and fullness, but always prioritizing satisfaction and, kind of honoring taste hunger is so important, because eating is more than just about nutrition. We celebrate with food. We do have emotional relationships with food. And I think that that's part of a healthy relationship with food. But we're also honoring, this idea that food matters, but just maybe not in the way that we've been led to believe. So applying gentle nutrition and how to build a balanced plate, and maybe how to think about that adding in strategy versus trying to take away and control. But we're also respecting some of the things we can't control, like genetics, for example. We can't always control what our body looks like on the inside or the outside, because the largest influence on that is genetics. But yeah, it's a framework, and there's a training and a certification program for health professionals, and so that we're kind of always trying to move people away from restricted and rigid to flexible and forgiving.
Yeah, and I think the reason why it's so difficult, isn't it, for so many of us, is that for so many years there have been so many different stories and narratives of people saying, eat this, eat that, what sort of diet, keto, whatever it might be, that it's a bit like, well, it's obviously incredibly difficult for women to actually know what to eat. We've been fed so much for so long, and the one thing we do actually all have to do every day is make that decision of what to eat. And that can actually become really quite stressful if you're kind of going, should I eat like this? Should I eat like that? So this is sounds like a really nice framework to actually just give yourself a break and really take a deep breath and actually stop listening to that bombardment of different messages, which, is an unlearning process in itself.
Yeah. And it's hard to imagine that you're playing a game, and let's say that it's football or soccer for anyone in North America listening. So, imagine that you're playing that game, and every time that you show up or every time a new season starts, the rules have changed. And some of the people will, be able to follow those rules really well. Others will feel really conflicted. And when the rules change, that might mean that the game is easier or harder to play for some people, depending on their past experience, depending on, kind of their innate abilities. And so that's kind of what happens with, I think, diet culture and dieting, is that the rules are changing all the time. And that's usually a good kind of first warning that if the rules are always having to change, maybe there's something wrong with the game. And maybe we're playing the wrong game, meaning if we're making weight loss and the number on the scale, the ultimate measure of success or whether something works, we're probably going to have to keep changing the rules because nothing is going to work for all people. And, again, when we start putting in rules around what people can and can't eat, should and shouldn't eat, it becomes harder for them to follow anything because that restriction creates deprivation, which creates craving. And I mean, we can see that with, everything from budgeting to food. If we tell ourselves we can't have something, it's a psychological truism that we will want it more.
Yeah, the number on the scale is not a marker of good health at all. And I think we really need to get out of that thinking. So in terms of the other markers of good health at this stage, I mean, obviously energy is a really important one because a lot of women I know suffer with the amount of energy they have. So it's actually feeding yourself for energy and tracking how much energy you have, because we all know that if we restrict food, actually you can really lack in energy, can't you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think energy is a great subjective one, because when we feel like we have the energy to do the things that we want to do, that's a great kind of immediate feedback that what we're doing is working for us, right? And oftentimes I find that, even just having the conversation around carbohydrates can really contribute to people having more energy, because many women are trying to restrict carbohydrates, especially in the earlier and busier parts of their day, because they're worried about the blood sugar spike and they're worried about insulin, and they've been told it's better to have more protein or more fat. Like, they have all of these rules floating around in their head, and they're exhausted at 2:00 in the afternoon, and they haven't had any carbohydrates. They've only had protein. They've only had leafy greens. They've only had fat. And sometimes just adding in, carbohydrates in, a form that is enjoyable and satisfying and filling can be such a game changer. I was talking to someone last week who said she felt like she had rocket fuel put into her body just by having carbohydrates at breakfast and lunch. Like, she felt like you could feel her brain turn on for the first time in years because it had been ingrained in her head not to have carbohydrates before lunch. Mm-hmm. So don't underestimate how powerful food can be, but again, thinking about permission and not restriction.
In terms of when you talk about carbohydrates, what sort of carbohydrates are you talking here? Because there's a whole scale of carbohydrates. You've kind of got your very processed white carbohydrates, and then you've obviously got your whole foods in their entirety. So are you talking both ends of the scale?
Well, I mean, we try not to moralize our food choices. And so let's say, for example, let's use white rice, because that's a really common one that comes up. People will say, well, I had brown rice, or I'm trying to have quinoa instead. But if what you want is white rice, there are ways that you can add balance to it so that you don't have to be as kind of worried or concerned about the impact on blood sugar, for example. So if you want to have white rice, then what protein, fat, and fiber could we add to it to make that feel like it's a more balanced plate? But there's nothing wrong with any particular foods, but I always kind of try and frame it as what is going to contribute to fullness and satisfaction. And it doesn't have to be perfect every time. So, if let's say, for example, leading with satisfaction and I want to have potato chips. Well, potato chips can be part of my carbohydrate, but just having potato chips is not going to be filling or satisfying, right? So what can I add to that? But oftentimes when I'm working with people in this undieting process, we do have to kind of move a little bit away from the kind of ranking of foods. And so, because ultimately all carbohydrates come down to glucose, right? And so we can influence a little bit the speed that happens. We can influence how satisfying those foods are. But ultimately, they do all end up in the same place.
What is coming to mind, though, is this whole issue of obesity. That's an interesting one because obviously a lot of people cannot control how much they're eating because it's leading to obesity, and that obviously leads to many, many health problems. So I'm kind of interested in your take on that.
Yeah, and I think sometimes labels can be problematic. And, there's a lot of, I would say, controversy around using the word obesity because it doesn't really describe what's happening. It just describes a larger body, right? And so if we start to think about, well, what are the health effects of living in a larger body? They're not always true for all people. And so I like to kind of try and bring it back to say that, well, we know that BMI is problematic. There's quite a bit of evidence that it is not as useful as an individual tool for assessment. It was meant for population data. And the categories of how we define body shapes and sizes are often tied to that, right? So the categories of obesity, for example, are tied to BMI. But if we're looking at health, we can measure metabolic health markers a little bit more specifically that maybe, and those metabolic health markers, so for example, insulin resistance or blood sugar, if we focus on that as what we're measuring, we will find that we can find abnormalities in those in, people of all shapes and sizes. And so we are then a little bit more focused on a specific measurable thing that does have, a treatment strategy associated with it of things that we can do to try and improve that marker that can be completely independent of prescribing weight loss or prescribing, a number target in terms of reaching the scale. So I always like to try and bring it back to say, okay, if we feel the need to categorize people, is it really meaningful to categorize them based on their weight? Does it actually tell us anything about what we're hoping to improve? Does it actually lead us to any plans or things that we can add in? And most of the time it doesn't. So, so I guess it's kind of a complicated answer to a bit of a complicated question, but I'm all about adding in and focusing on the behaviors because ultimately we are not as in control of our body shape and size as we've been led to believe, but we can control the behaviors that we're choosing. We can control, managing our stress levels. We can learn to add in a wider variety of foods that maybe have, some health outcomes that we're looking for. So adding in more fiber, adding in more protein, trying to cook more often, trying to eat with, your family. All of those are health behaviors that we can control that can have a positive impact, that we don't have to rely on a category to define whether or not they're healthy or not.
And I imagine if you're eating in that way, the weight is naturally just going to probably fall off anyway.
For some people, there are weight changes. But I always say that we never want to make that the goal, because what happens is that if you make that the goal and you don't achieve weight loss, even if your health is improved, you are less likely to want to keep doing it.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit of a mindset issue that, I use this story all the time of, imagine that you've shown up for a walk in the forest and you're there because you want to see the plants and the animals and breathe the fresh air and you're really excited, and you show up and your guide says, yep, we're going to do all those things, but there's also some golden eggs that are hidden along the way. And anybody who gets to the end with a golden egg is going to be the winner. And so even if you're there for the plants and the animals and the air and the trees, you're still going to be wondering, oh, I'd really like to find that golden egg though. And maybe you kind of divert off the path because you get a little distracted by looking for that golden egg. And even if you've had a lovely walk and a lovely hike and you get to the end and you haven't found the golden egg, you're probably going to feel a little disappointed. So it's the same with making weight loss part of your health goals. That if your goal is to improve your health, I love encouraging people and helping them to set the weight loss goals aside and just accept that how you feel at the end, if you feel better for the things that you've added in, is the outcome that you actually want. And it's definitely, I think, one of the harder things for people to trust, to develop that body trust with. But it's definitely, I think, a more sustainable way of encouraging people to pursue health.
Exactly, because we are now, particularly in midlife, this is about a way of living. It's not about constantly being in that cycle of restricting, feeling miserable about our bodies. It's about living, isn't it? And it's about feeling good. And it's about longevity. It's about looking after our bodies, making our bodies strong so that we can be as vital and as mobile and as strong as we possibly can for as long as we can. So we've got to learn to really trust our bodies and love our bodies. And ultimately, for those who are really experiencing perimenopause symptoms and changes, it's about managing those, getting on top of those. And that's what's important, so that you can then ripple out to everybody else around you as well as yourself and feel good and have those positive impacts. So
absolutely.
So it does. It really does make so much sense. So Jenn, in terms of perimenopause, is there anything else you feel is important for women going through this stage of life to know about really eating, how to eating really for themselves to feel as well as possible?
I mean, I love helping women to love food again. And so many women, I think, get to midlife having spent a large percentage of their life already fearing food, not trusting their body. And now all of these changes are happening, and their sleep changes and their mood changes and their body changes, and their whole experience of kind of living in their life is changing. And it can be really isolating. So I really encourage women to talk about it, to, talk to the people in their lives so that they can see that they're not alone. But when it comes to food, to welcome it back as a source of pleasure and enjoyment, as well as nutrition. So, I think that being able to see your relationship with food as something that needs to fit into your life instead of an aspect of your life that you have to control really nourishes us in a way that helps our midlife experience to feel a little bit more welcoming and safer and just a kinder place to be.
Love that. As I ask all my guests, my final question is, so because this is called the Positive Perimenopause Podcast, I always like to give the listeners just one, if they were to take away one practical, actionable step to have a positive perimenopause, what would yours be, Jenn?
This is funny because this actually came up in a group call I had last night. And I feel like my new advice for everyone is going to be wear underwear that fits.
Yep.
Because as we were talking about, I think that we deprioritize underwear and we wear the stuff that's like, holy and falling apart, and the bra that's just a little bit uncomfortable because we don't want or don't have time to go get a new one. But it's such a game changer in how we feel in our bodies when we're wearing bra and underwear that's comfortable. So that's my cheeky, but also true advice.
It's so true. It makes such a difference how you feel within yourself. So Thank you for that reminder. I'm totally going to take that on board as well. Jenn, thank you so much. It's been so lovely to chat to you today. For anybody who is interested in finding out more about you or working with you, where can people find you?
best place is always going to be on Instagram at menopause.nutritionist. And there are links in my bio there to anything that I have on the go. And I really love helping to just kind of bring women together for, just a better midlife experience that also involves food.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Oh, and also your podcast as well. For anybody who would like to listen to Jen, it's called The Midlife Feast.
Yes.
And can catch it in all the usual places.
Yep.
Brilliant.
Thanks so much, Polly.
Thank you, Jen. I really hope that after this conversation, you can see dieting through a new lens and realize that actually restricting food isn't the answer. If you enjoyed this conversation, I would be so, so grateful if you could leave this podcast a review, because it really does help more than you know to help get this podcast out there and help more women ultimately. The easiest way to leave a review is to go to Apple Podcasts. If you've got an iPhone, there's an app on your iPhone. It's a purple kind of icon. Or you can actually go into your browser and just put in Apple Podcasts. And from there, you can rate, review, and subscribe and leave a review there. And I'd be so grateful. And I just want to say thank you so much for listening. It totally means everything to me. Every single download I receive, every single one of you makes this all worthwhile. And I am really so grateful. Thank you. So have a wonderful, wonderful week, and I really look forward to speaking to you next time.